Welcome back to Beyond Your Balance Sheet from the Sedora Group of Steward Partners Global Advisory. I'm Laura Kanoy. Beyond Your Balance Sheet is a conversation series that's part of the Sedora Group's wider goal to help clients achieve well-being and live fulfilling lives. As planners, they offer financial guidance and expertise, but they also recognize the need to pay attention to mind, body, heart, and soul. And well being often begins at home. So, in this episode, we'll focus on a family phenomenon that's taken off over the past decade: multi generational households. The numbers are impressive. According to our guest, 1 in 4 Americans now lives in a home where at least 3 generations are present. And she says these households are here to stay. We're talking with Donna Butts, Executive Director of Generations United, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit leading intergenerational strategies and promoting the well being of children, youth, and older Americans. Donna Butts, it is great to meet you. Thank you for sharing your research and sharing your time. Welcome to Beyond Your Balance Sheet.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to talk with you today.
So, according to a study that your group put out last year, 1 in 4 Americans, as I just cited, is now living in a household with at least 3 generations present. That's an enormous jump from just a decade ago, Donna. Really interesting. What's driving this trend?
There are a number of things that are driving it, Laura, including financial reasons, which is a very big one for many people, the ability to pool their resources and support each other. But there's also caregiving. What we found in some of our research is that 34% of the people said that they started living together because of childcare needs, and 34% said they started living together because of elder care needs. So it helps with caregiving. But there also are cultural differences, and there's changes in our country because of the demographic shifts that make it much more welcoming and open for people to live under one roof.
What about the pandemic, Donna? What impact did that have?
Pandemic had a huge impact. We saw the biggest spikes in multi-generational households, one, when there was a recession in our country, and then two, with the pandemic. Many people moved in together and reported that. Over 50% reported that as the reason why they went under one roof together. But what's really interesting is that 7 out of 10 of those people say they're going to continue to live together even as the pandemic subsides.
Now that's interesting. And I was going to ask you that question. What happens after the pandemic? So it sounds like this trend is here to stay. Some people might move out on their own, but some people will stick together.
It is a trend that's here to stay. We saw that again 10 years ago after the recession. People said, oh, the numbers will go back down. But instead, they steadily increased. And so, of course, we saw a spike with the pandemic, but we expect that they're going to continue to increase, continue to grow. Now, you will see some variations depending on the family. Adult children that move back home because their college is shut down or they couldn't find a job are going to find themselves in a different market now and be able to go back to school or be able to move out on their own as they find work. But for many of the family members, they're finding it takes care of so many issues being able to be under one roof.
Wow. Well, and I've heard you say, and I love this quote, Donna, you often say families come together by need, but they stay together by choice. What's making them choose to stay together?
It's really interesting because what we find is that the families do come together. They find ways to work things out and they see the benefit. So it does help with caregiving. If you have aging parents and you're worried about them because they're halfway across the country, it's much easier if they're in the other wing of your house. If you are somebody who's had to shift to work at home and you've got children running around, it's so much more helpful to have your parents there to help care for the children. So it's sharing those kind of caregiving responsibilities, but also the financial aspects. People can live oftentimes in a bigger house, one that accommodates all their needs. They can live in an area they might not be able to afford to live in alone. So there are a number of reasons why they do. The shared responsibility. I was talking with someone recently, and his mother-in-law who moved in with them is a gourmet cook. So he doesn't cook anymore, and he gets great dinners every night.
That sounds good to me. After the
Does it?
pandemic, I'm kind of tired of cooking. So,
Yeah, I'm tired of mine too.
one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your study, Donna, is that in addition to the, obvious benefits to the individuals in these households and to the family unit itself, what are the broader societal benefits of multi-generational living?
I think there's a number of broader societal benefits. Um, one of the things that we found is that families are, because they're able to share costs like utilities, food, and other things, they have less of an environmental footprint. So there are those aspects, but also because we do struggle as a country with caregiving. And coming out of the pandemic, we know that the childcare industry, the elder care industry are ones that have been really decimated. So to be able to share care within a family is very, very helpful.
Oh, that's interesting. Given the worker shortages in those caregiving industries, and you're so right, this trend helps ease some of those shortages. Also, the environmental benefits. I thought that was really interesting too, Don. I had not thought about that. If you've got one household turning on the heat and using electricity, that's better than two or three households turning on the heat and using electricity.
Most definitely.
You mentioned the demographics a moment ago, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. In your research, what have you seen in terms of demographics around income levels, race, region of the country, and so forth?
Well, as you can imagine, because multi-generational living is much more common in other countries and in other cultures, there's a higher percentage of multi-generational households among Hispanic families, among Asian families, and among Black families than there are among white families. So our newly immigrant population, it's much more likely to live under one roof, to welcome new family members into the country. So that's one factor that weighs in. It's also more prevalent in the South and the West, as well as along the border areas of our country.
That's interesting. So, does that have to do with those racial and ethnic demographics, Donna, or is there something else at play as well?
I think it has to do with that, but I also think that one of the things that's interesting to me is when you think about it, our country was settled by multi-generational families. When people first came here, they lived together. They needed to be able to survive. And then we grew apart and people started to live in other parts of the country. And then we made it sort of the norm for them to not live together. And we actually turned up our noses and said there's something wrong with people if they're living together. And so now what we're finding is people are coming back together, finding it works, but also a lot of our newer citizens are people who bring that with them with their rich cultural nature.
You mentioned stereotypes, and, as you said, we used to turn our nose up at that. And I myself have been guilty of saying, to my two sons, you're going to be 30 years old and living in my basement. And after I talked to you, I felt a little bit badly about saying that. What are the stereotypes around multi-generational living?
Well, and it's okay to tell your children that, Laura. It's fine. Don't
Thank
worry
you.
about that. Don't worry about that. Because I think that one thing we have to keep in mind is that multi-generational family and multi-generational living isn't for everyone. But what we have to remember is it works for a lot of people. And so the stereotypes that we have that, oh, the person is a loser because they can't support themselves, they can't live by themselves, is really wrong. In fact, it really, really does help family members of all ages. So what we need to do is realize and respect the families and respect the choice and make sure that people are able to live together should that be their choice.
What kind of stressors do multi-generational families report to you, Donna? You've talked to a lot of these families in your report. You highlight some amazing families. What are some of their sources of stress?
One of my favorites was someone who said people have to realize that just because somebody's going to move in with you doesn't mean they're going to change. If they were a night owl, they're going to be a night owl. If they're a slob, they're going to be a slob. And that could cause stress if someone's moving into a home and they have different habits in terms of even how they eat, the hours they keep, the company, the music, the television. So what's really, really important is that people talk with each other, and they have regular times where they're checking in with each other to talk about how it's working, how it's not working. And I think a really big key is to respect people's privacy, because where we see it work the most and the most successfully is when people have their together time and their alone time, their space, and also the space to come together.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. That's a big part of this report, the infrastructure that multi-generational families need to be successful. What do they need, Donna, and how hard is it for them to get it?
Well, as you look at multi-generational living across the socioeconomic demographics, obviously people need different things at different income levels and different abilities. So oftentimes the families are able to either build or move into a home that was designed for a multi-generational family, or they're able to add another bedroom on or another bathroom. Because what people find a lot of the stress is if they don't have enough bedrooms, if they don't have a large enough common space, if they don't have options. So if they have an outdoor space, they have an indoor space, that really, really helps. But again, it's, can they build that extra room? Can they build, or can they move into, can they pool their resources and move into a house that was designed for a multi-generational family? That makes a difference.
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the housing stock here in New England, and it's old and it was set up in another time. And it's sometimes difficult to make those adjustments and expensive. I wonder how much you see home builders tapping into this trend.
Home builders have figured it out. According to the National Realtors Association, the number one house design that new home buyers are looking for is multi-generational households.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow, that's
it's the most,
interesting. Yeah.
it's what people are thinking about the future. And if it's younger home buyers, they're thinking about their parents, they're thinking about their children. They may be thinking about a nanny. They may be thinking about, more of a life course approach to where they live. If they want a house that's going to be there and be what they need at various times. So builders have realized that. Remodelers as well. I've talked to remodelers who they can't keep up with the business because people are trying to add in-law suites or extra rooms or bump their house out a little bit. So they really have figured it out. Where we're seeing some conflict is another way that people have managed to come together, maybe not under one roof, but on the same piece of property, is an accessory dwelling. It might be a little unit in the backyard or in your driveway, and there can be some conflict in neighborhoods or with city zoning when it comes to those kind of units. But those units also make it more affordable and more possible for families to live together.
Right, the mother-in-law apartment, as they used to call it, either added onto the house itself or put on the property. So home builders are getting it, but cities and towns aren't quite getting it yet. Donna, what kind of barriers are they putting up or opposition are they putting up?
Well, I think an example I give you is close to here in Washington, D.C., in Montgomery County, Maryland. And for years, there was a councilman who advocated for accessory dwellings. And it didn't pass because the opposition would say it's just going to increase the density. Traffic's already bad. The infrastructure's not there. It's going to increase the density, even though the argument was that it allowed families to have other family members near them. And so just recently, the council finally passed an ordinance that said that they could add accessory dwellings. So it's making those arguments. But people, you know how people are. It's always like, it's great, but not in my backyard,
Mm-hmm.
or it's wonderful, but there's always a but, and we have to get to an and instead of a but.
Wow, that must take up a lot of your time in terms of what your organization has to do, sort of council by council, city by city, town by town, looking at these ordinances. In addition to physical infrastructure, I'd like to ask you about social infrastructure, Donna, because your report talks about that as well. So what do these households find lacking when it comes to the social structure or the social fabric of where they live?
Well, the social fabric, I think one of the big issues, as we talked about earlier, is the need for childcare and elder care. So one of the things that we advocate for are what are called shared care or intergenerational shared sites, where a family could have their caregiving needs taken care of. There'd be a child care center that's co-located with an adult daycare center, or a pre-K that's in a center where you can take your parents and your children. Instead, we've separated out all those services instead of thinking of the family as a whole and thinking of the family as multi-generational. It's also access to supports when they need it, because sometimes there are stress or family members experiencing a difficult time. So it's making sure that those kind of access to services and supports are there, that they can address the mental health needs, they can address their health needs, all of those things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until I read your report. And then I thought, well, sure, why not have childcare and elder care in the same facility? And not only is it more convenient for the family who might be dropping off, but there might be some synergies there between the very old and the very young.
You're so right. There's synergy, there's life. What I love about intergenerational shared sites is, one, that they use resources better, because you're not maintaining two facilities, you're not maintaining two staffs necessarily, or infrastructure. But also, it's like one provider told me, when you have children and they may be acting up in the child care center, and then you have older adults and they may be lethargic and just being around other older adults, and you put the two together and the children calm down, the older adults perk up, because they rise to meet the expectations of the others. They're needed. They enhance each other. They enjoy each other. It really sparks a wonderful connection.
Social, emotional benefits, and then, of course, cost sharing. Maybe you have one kitchen instead of two kitchens, and you
Mhm.
only have one set of electric bills instead of two sets of electric bills. You touched on this before, Donna, but I want to ask you again. So at the very granular family level, when a family is, something happens, someone loses a job, or there's a health crisis, or a new baby is born, what advice do you give families as they enter these living situations for the first time?
If it's all possible, Laura, what we say is sit down and talk before you move in together. Talk about what the expectations are. Talk about all of those things that are could potentially create stress. Who's going to pay for what? Who's going to cook? Who's going to clean? What are the expectations about who's going to pay a utility bill? Who's going to drive somebody to the store? Who's going to do those kinds of things? So it's like making almost a contract or a commitment to each other to really talk about those details, and then make sure that as you go into the situation and you've been in the situation, you regularly look back, because things change. Somebody's job may change, somebody may retire, somebody, the child may not need care anymore. So things change. So revisit that. But communication is essential.
Yeah, it sounds like a real checklist of things, including some things that I had not thought of before. Also, probably breaking up old patterns. If an adult child moves back, he or she may be used to mom and dad doing X, Y, or Z. And guess what? Mom and dad don't want to do that anymore. So,
But you're right. You also touched on one, which is if they're with multi-generational families, the grandparents may think of child rearing in one way, and the parents may think of it in another. So it's to be very clear about what those expectations are. Now, there can be that wonderful role that a grandparent may play by slipping a little extra ice cream in the bowl, but you want to make sure that there's not serious conflict about how the child is being raised.
wow. Yes, I can see how that might happen. Grandparents living there is great, but they might have raised their kids differently and so have different expectations. So you need to talk about how are you going to express that, mom or dad? What's one message that you'd like to leave us with, Donna, about multi-generational households for those Americans who do not live in multi-generational settings?
I think we all need to realize, and I hope we're starting to see the tide turn, that multi-generational living is here to stay. Again, it's in our history, it's in our DNA, and it's coming back. It's come back, and it's going to continue. And what we need to do is respect the families where it does work, and let them live their lives. Don't look down. Don't treat them as though there's some sort of stigma or something's wrong, but celebrate the fact that families are strong. Families are the cornerstone of our society, of our culture. And whether they're multi-generational, single generation, whatever they look like, we should support families.
Dawn, it's been really nice to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to talk with you.
Thanks also to our engineer, RJ Perkins, and to the Sedora Group of Steward Partners for sponsoring this series. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Beyond Your Balance Sheet. Keep your eyes on this website for more information. I'm Laura Kanoy. Thanks, everyone, for being with us.